All right. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nick Townley, the chair of the New England chapter, and it's great to have so many of you with us here today from around the country and around the world, and for us to have Hubert-Jan Lekkerkerk here from Skilltrade, a hydrographic and geodesy training provider, who's presenting on three very topical topics today, which are datum transformations, meridian convergence, and vertical datums. Now, there is a certain amount of assumed knowledge in these presentations, and we won't be able to answer all the questions that are asked. So what we want to do is to get you to put the questions into chat, and then Dr. Pete Ramsey will be going through the chat questions, and at the end of each 20-minute presentation, we'll be answering those questions to our esteemed presenter. Please only unmute yourself if you need to clarify the question which has been asked, if it is your question. I'd like to introduce Hubert-Jan. He's been teaching hydrographic and information management for 20 years. He holds a bachelor's degree in hydrography and maritime electronics, as well as a master's in geographic information management. When he started his career in the early 90s, it was mostly for government agencies, with short stints with the dredging and offshore companies. But since 1999, he's been working very actively as a client representative for dredging projects. And in addition to client repping and lecturing, Hubert-Jan has also been instrumental in the publication of the Handbook of Offshore Surveying and GNSS for surveyors and engineers. And you probably also know him as the senior technical editor and contributor for Hydro International and GIM International. So thank you for joining us today, Hubert-Jan. And before I hand over, I would also like to ask all of you to please spread the word about the New England chapter scholarships that we have. The applications are still open until April 30th, and we have 4 $1,000 scholarships on offer. So if you know someone studying in New England, then please make sure that you go ahead and let them know and tell them to apply before it's too late. All right. Thank you very much, Hubert-Jan.
Thank you very much, Nick. So glad you would have me here. I would say thanks to Corona, because before that it would have been a long trip. For those of you who are not aware, I'm residing in the Netherlands. So digitally this works out quite fine. What I'll do is I'll start sharing my screen so that you can actually see what I'll be talking about. There we go. If I've done everything correctly, you should be seeing the presentation right now. So basically mini lectures. Nick said 20 minutes. I'll be honest, some topics will be a little bit longer, some a little bit shorter. We'll see where we get. It's the first time I've done 3 subjects in such a short time. So normally each one of these will take about an hour. So I've got a challenge set for myself, but we'll see where we get and what's gonna happen. So basically, some of the disclaimers you've already heard from Nick, but I thought I'd do it again. First of all, as I've just told you, I'm not an American. And that means that my knowledge of US coordinate systems, and I will try to use them, is mainly based on documentation that I found online. So all the mistakes that I'll be making are mine and mine alone. Although I should say I saw Danny Swain in this meeting as well. And I'll be honest, I had him in my class quite a few years ago, and he taught me a thing or two about US coordinate systems. So maybe the errors are not mine alone then. Also, as Nick said, I'm assuming a basic knowledge of geodesy. So I'll be going into specific topics. If something go over your head, I'll be glad to mention the Skilltrade courses that we offer. Those are both e-learning and in person, hopefully after we come out of this pandemic. So basically, just to set you up before we start doing the other stuff. Now, basically, these are the 3 topics that I've used to lure you in. And we're going to discuss them anyway. But, well, you have to have catchy titles when you do a presentation like this. But in the end, what does it come down to? Well, basically, we need to talk about horizontal positions. We need to talk about vertical positions. And we need to talk about directions. What I've sort of ignored for now, but I thought 4 topics in one lecture might be a little bit too much, is the 4th dimension, which is time, of course. But there needs to be a limit to everything. As you can see in the picture, they are all related, and especially nowadays, you can't see horizontals without the verticals. They come together. We're all using GNSS as our basic navigation aid, as our basic positioning aid, I should rather say. But people are still used to getting their heights, for example, based on a leveling datum. Same for the horizontals. We still may be using old datums or older datums that are not directly related to what we're doing in GNSS. So as a result, we need to discuss what's going on between these various systems. So up towards the first topic, which is on datum transformations. And datum transformations, well, you can say a lot about them, but it all starts with the fact that we have too many datums as it is. Quite often they come from history, although I'll be honest, some of them are more recent. But in the end, what we're stuck with is that we've made models of the Earth in the past, and those models are not necessarily the same. And they have different sizes, but they also are oriented in different ways. Of course, you all know that the combination of an ellipsoid plus its connection to the Earth is what we call the horizontal datum. And what I've done is I've looked at what's what's available for the United States, and this is what I've come around to, including the NATRF 2022. Couldn't really find how far you were along with the implementation of that, but looking at the date, I would say it's a year into the future, and you'll have to switch to that. So I'll be taking that into account as well in these lectures, because in Europe, we've been using systems like that for slightly longer, and we have some experience with them as well, and I wanted to talk about that. Now, on the picture below, you can, of course, see, I'm assuming you've seen that before, but this is the difference between NAD 27 and NAD 83. And these are the differences in meters that you would expect to find depending on your location. With the datum point for NAD 27 in this picture. It's a slightly older picture, but so is the datum, of course. Now, basically, what are we talking about with these issues? Well, in GNSS, we're stuck with a worldwide datum. And when I say stuck, I don't mean that in a negative sense. But the problem is that quite often clients require a local datum. And local, I don't mean it's a very small size thing, could be regional. NAD 27 is an example of a regional datum because it doesn't go outside, same for NAD 83, outside of the Americas. In Europe, we're stuck with endless numbers of datums. And to give you an idea, there are about 50 ellipsoids around the world, and there's about over 200 different datums derived from them. So basically, each country has at least a few of them. Now, to go from one datum to the other, we've also learned that we need a datum transformation. And the datum transformation, the classic one, I would say is the 7-parameter datum transformation, where we use a translation, a rotation, and a shift. There are other varieties, as you can see in this slide, but basically we're talking about 7 parameters as sort of the mainstay in the hydrographic industry. Although you'll be seeing the 14 parameter coming up more and more, especially if you look at the software. And we need to discuss what's going on with that. So, like I said, most datums are what I would call local or regional, and there's a long list of them. Now, I'm not certain about the United States, but sometimes when you live in Europe, you get the impression that in America, people think that the American things are the only things in the world. So I thought I'd set you straight here. So it's not just WGS84 that's around. It's not just GPS. We have a few other GNSSs in the world. And each GNSS comes with its own coordinate system. Not many people realize that because it's quite often solved in the receiver, or at least that's what we think. But basically, besides WGS84, we have the Galileo system, the GLONASS, and the Beidou system. On top of that, we have an international system, the International Terrestrial Reference Frame. And I've put XX in because there are many versions of that. Every couple of years, there's a new version of ITRF. And we need to discuss that, and I'll do that in the next slides. But basically, ITRF is the best world geodetic system. Let's use the name rather than just indicating the GPS variety. But there are multiple versions. And as you can see in the slide, GPS is aligned with the latest version to within about 10 centimeters. In Galileo, they use a similar system, but they align it to within 3 centimeters. GLONASS, well, as it says, it's coupled to the Eurasian plate, and that's a bit of an issue. I need to come around to that in one of the next slides. And Beidou, again, coupled to the Eurasian plate, and they're using an older version of the International Terrestrial Reference Frame. What this means is that the GNSSs are on somewhat similar coordinate systems, but not the same. So there are small variations between them, and those could influence your measurements. Now, 20 years ago, I wouldn't have had much to talk about in this sense. 20 years ago, we would say, well, they're basically all the same as WGS84 and be done with that. Today, well, if we talk 10 centimeter level differences, we're talking about the accuracy of our GNSS systems. So we need to think about what's going on with these small differences and how that influences our measurement. Just to give you an idea, what do we get from our measurements? What's going on in the real world? Well, let's start with a simple version. We do land survey. If we do land survey, we're going to be using control points, benchmarks, trig points, give them a name, but we're using those points that have known coordinates quite often in a local chart projection. No problem there, because we're doing local surveys using local points, we're getting local coordinates, and everything is going right. If we go with our handheld GNSS, basically the one we use in the car, what we get is the GNSS datum. So it depends a bit on what we're logged into, but essentially we can assume they're all basically WGS84. The small differences do not really matter, because what are we talking about? Well, differences of a few centimeters are basically non-existent if your accuracy is on the meter level. You'll never see them. If you use more than one GNSS, things start to get a little bit tricky. But in practice, most GNSS receivers will solve that. They will iron out the small differences between the GNSS systems, and then they'll output the datum. And well, most of the time, if they adhere to the standards, that will be again WGS84. So far, nothing's really going wrong. This was the situation that we had to talk about 30 years ago, 25 years ago. Then we started to do DGPS or DGNSS. But that's basically the same as normal GNSS, although slightly more accurate. So again, we're still in the same ballpark. Now things are getting interesting. We are using RTK, and probably if you go offshore, PPP, more and more and more. Well, when I say more and more, again, I'm not certain what it is like in the United States, but I do a lot of work on dredging projects, and a dredging company that doesn't bring an RTK to the project, well, I'm not seeing them anymore. Offshore, PPP is the standard nowadays. I'm assuming you all know that PPP stands for precise point positioning, and that we're now talking about, well, sub-decimeter level accuracy horizontally, better than 2 decimeters vertically, depends a bit on which numbers you take and what marketing lingo you subscribe to. But essentially, we're talking 1 to 2 decimeter level accuracy. So that's very accurate. With RTK, basically we're doing relative positioning. So our coordinates are immediately linked to the base station. So it depends a bit on how corrections are transmitted and what system they're transmitted in, because we're going to be picking up the same coordinates at our rover. That means if we set up our own base station, we have some control. If we use somebody else's base station, we need to know what's going on there. What system are they using? And quite often that will be not WGS84, but a regional coordinate system. But again, differences may occur. PPP, that's a worldwide system. The base stations are now worldwide, or at least the stations providing you with the accurate data are worldwide. And as a standard, they're using ITRF. And then one of the realizations, as we call that, so one of the numbers. 2014 would be the most recent one. So in PPP, although we think we're using maybe only GPS, we might not be getting WGS84 positions, but rather we're getting them in ITRF something. As we've seen in the previous slide, the difference between the two could amount to something like 10 centimeters. In practice, it's usually a little bit less. So the question is, do we worry about that or not? Well, if we didn't worry about that, that would be the end of the presentation, but I've got a few more slides. So, because one thing we need to think about is what we call world stability. And I'm not talking the political side of it, I'm talking the geophysical side of things, the geological side. And what we do know is continents are on the move. This happens every day. And in this picture, thanks to the NASA, you can see the speed at which the continental plates are drifting apart. And I've just put in a few numbers. And the big numbers are sort of approximate, but it gives you an idea. So basically, looking at the United States and Europe, so basically the two sides of the picture that is in this presentation, we can see that they're drifting apart by about 2.5 centimeters per year. Now, again, 20 years ago, nobody would have really worried about that, because when we talk coordinate systems, 2.5 centimeters a year, that's not that much. Way before that, when we did land survey, we didn't have a problem at all, because in land survey, we're using local coordinate systems. They're on one continent, and that continent is moving together with the points that are located on it. But in essence, the same happens to a geodetic datum that's connected to a continental plate. So when we start connecting our geodetic datum to a continental plate, we're okay within that continental plate. However, another datum, which could have exactly the same parameters, but which is linked to another continental plate, will slowly move position relative to the rest of the world. Or in other words, horizontal datums could move, but do not necessarily have to move. It now starts to depend on how we define our coordinate system, on how we define our datum. Now, when we talk datums like WGS84 or ITRF in general, they are worldwide. They are not connected to any of the continental plates. But when we start to talk about regional coordinate systems, and from what I've understood from the documentation, but this is where things get risky, but what I've understood is NATRF 2022 is just like the ETRS 89 that we use in Europe, connected to the American plate. Actually, there are a few versions of it. For each continental plate, there's a different horizontal datum. But that has implications for when we start to use GNSS, which basically has a worldwide coordinate system. And just to give you an idea, this is for the Netherlands. I've just switched there because we have slightly longer history, so I can show you some data. And I've picked the Netherlands because that's where I live, making life a little bit easier again for myself. But what you're looking at here is some of the data for ETRF 89 versus WGS 84. So what we're looking at here is basically the coordinates that we would get from a GPS receiver relative to the European framework of 1989, which, like I said, is, from my perspective, similar to what you'll be getting in 2022. Now, we had this 2.5 centimeter per year drift between the continents, and actually you can see that horizontal drift here in the picture. This is in meters, and what you can see is from this point onwards, we have sort of a gradual move. It's not constant, it fluctuates a little bit, but overall you can see that right now we're about 80 centimeters off in the Netherlands on average. So this is for a point in the Netherlands. Horizontally, things are sort of okay. We're talking a few millimeters to at most 1.5 centimeters. So these differences are relatively small, but this horizontal difference is a bit of an issue because it means that every time we use a system that uses a world geodetic system, like one that's coupled to an ITRF version, we need to start thinking about the differences between the two. To make matters worse, this number is not a constant for an area. So what I've done here is a 3 by 3 degree area for the Netherlands for the epoch of 2021. And what you're looking at here, the blue arrows are the horizontal positions, including their direction, and the red ones are the vertical arrows, including the meters, so in this case about 2.5 centimeters difference. And you can see that the horizontal change differs throughout this grid. Not by much, it's a few centimeters, but we have both a horizontal, so a spatial, and a temporal difference between the coordinate systems. Now, in essence, something similar could happen in the Americas because you're drifting at the same rate, although in the other direction, of course. Well, seen from Europe in this case. So what's the real problem that we're having? Because I tried to end each slide with a real world problem. So basically, the real problem, it's not the datum transformation. We've been doing that for ages. All the software I've used starting in the 1990s had datum transformations built in. Usually the 7-parameter shift. Some of you may remember that software had 3 parameters, but basically datum transformation has been around, not forever in software maybe, but as long as I can remember. That's not the issue. The slow changes then, are they the issue? Well, maybe. What you need to realize is that when you use datum transformation, that your parameters will get old. The question is, how fast do they get old? And actually, that's why we use the 14-parameter shift nowadays. So if you use the 14-parameter shift, what you're getting are 2 things. You're getting 7 parameters, like a normal datum transformation, and you're getting the 7 changes over time. So actually, you can compensate for the small changes in your datum. Preferably, you do that in your software. So if your software is capable of 14 parameters, you put them in there. If not, you need to manually recompute them and then enter 7 parameters that are correct for your location and your time in the software. And remember, they change over time. So you can't just do this once. Depending on the required accuracy, you need to do this at a regular basis. That is, if you are using a system like PPP. When you're doing RTK, as shown earlier, you're still on the same continental plate, and as long as everything is in the same datum, you're okay there. Now, where things really could go wrong, and I'm saying could go wrong, because this depends on how your system is set up. But if you're using an ITRF output, so in this case, if you use PPP, you need to start thinking about how you get from PPP to whatever the client wants. Now, it depends a bit on the transformation parameters. And this is where things get tricky in Europe, because in Europe, the standard datum transformation is ETRS 89 to something local. Could be ED50 on the North Sea or the Dutch datum in the Netherlands. But we always work from ETRS 89. Why do we do that? Well, because it's coupled to a continental plate, the datum transformation parameters stay relatively fixed to that plate. But it also means that when we start to use PPP, which outputs ITRF, we need to take a double transformation. We need to go from ITRF to our European ETRS 89, and from there to whatever the client wants, like ED50. So we need a double transformation. Now the question is that possible? And the simple answer is, to my knowledge, all the main software packages I've looked at recently did not have that option. So in essence, what you can do is you can do one transformation. So you can do from ITRF to ETRS in Europe, or from ETRS to something else. In practice, what we do is we go from ETRS to our local system, and the others we do as what we call a block shift. So rather than doing a double transformation, we're assuming that the changes stay stable. Well, I've shown you in the picture that is not entirely true. So we might be losing out 1 or 2 centimeters in that block shift, in that assumption. I know some of you are by now starting to wonder, what is he talking about? We're talking centimeter level position problems. When is that a problem? Well, it became a problem when we started using PPP, and actually not when we started using that, but when we started showing the output of that to our clients. Because when we started showing the output to the clients and we told them we can now do centimeter level positioning anywhere in the world, they started to change their tenders. And now the tenders have gone from you can position your platform to within 1 meter. We now are stuck with 50 centimeters, and you can wait for that number to become lower and lower. And every time we ignore a few centimeters, we're eating out of our error budget for actually placing the damn thing. It needs to be there. There's some mechanical stuff involved as well. So it's not just the measurements. We need to start thinking, where can we get our measurements better so we have more leeway during the installation? Anyway, it was my first lecture. Just to give you an idea of what's going on in datum transformation and what I foresee happening in the near future in the Americas as well when you switch to N8TRF 2022. But at least this is what is happening in Europe at the moment. Any questions so far?
There are no questions that have come in on the meeting chat. Hubert Jan, there was an excellent description of data transformations. I'm going to kick off the questions. The current ITRF expression is 2014. Do you have any insight when this will be updated?
No, just like you, I'm on the receiving end of all of this. So I just need to cope with whatever is thrown my way. But I've been looking on the news sites and there's no clear indication that we can expect a new one very soon. Although looking at the progression of ITRFs, it is a bit overdue. So either the world has remained stable or the latest realization is so very good that they don't see the need to update it.
Good answer. And second question is, in terms of time variable data transformations, do you find that there is, you come across a lot of surveyors in the industry. Do you find that they have a good understanding of this now, or is there still a lot of room for improvement?
Well, most people I meet I've also trained by now, so they're supposed to have a good understanding. No, I'm kidding. No, the reason I've put these subjects on the list for tonight is they're all things that have come back in all the lectures where we have had to set people straight. So in the field, always a difficult story because quite often the setup gets done by a senior surveyor, and if it doesn't work, you'll find that out in the mobilization phase and somebody will correct it. But your question was, how is the understanding of the topic? And I would say it gives most people a really big headache thinking about plates moving 2.5 centimeters a year and coordinate systems shifting with that. And I'll be honest, when I started doing this, I come from a normal surveying background. So I sort of rolled into this quite a few years ago by now. But at first, I couldn't get my head around it either. So,
well, if you think 2.5 centimeters is bad, Australia is 7 centimeters a year.
Yes, and I'm not sure whether you noticed, but if you look at the Pacific Rim next to California, that's about 11 centimeters a year.
Okay. Are there any questions from the audience? If there are, just type them into the chat box. Otherwise, Nick, you happy to proceed with the next topic?
Certainly am. There's a lot of good food for thought here, and I'm enjoying it. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, let's proceed.
Okay, well, the good news is that due to a lack of questions, I'm back on schedule again because I was running a bit over. So the next part, well, that's the height part. And I want to discuss, again, one of those topics that give people, well, I'm not saying headaches, but sometimes even nightmares. That's because we're now getting into adding and subtracting. And as I always tell my students, there's nothing more difficult in hydrography than adding and subtracting. And it's not so much the mathematical operation as such, but it's the question what to do. Do we add or do we subtract? And the problem all comes from this. Again, GNSS is to blame. And to be honest, GNSS is to blame for many of our problems. It's also the reason we can do the surveys we do today. So I'm not going to start complaining. But with the introduction of GNSS, and especially things like RTK and PPP, we're sort of into trouble. Because I've not met a client yet who was happy if I gave him ellipsoid height. So if I gave him the raw output from the GPS. What they all want is something that compares to what they're used to, which is a leveling survey on land or some tide related level if we're going offshore. The problem is that those levels are based around gravity, and gravity is a physical phenomena. And that also means it changes around the world, depending on the local Earth, but also what happens within the crust of the Earth, we get differences in gravity. And what you're looking at in the colorful picture is the GRACE gravimetric, well, not the geoid, but the gravity differences around the Earth. And as you can clearly see, there is some sort of relation with topography. Usually when you're near a mountain range, you'll get slightly higher values, although there's not a one-to-one relation, because it doesn't just depend on what's going on the surface. We also need to look subsurface. Now, if you're in an oil company, this is also good information, but because it allows you to spot potential oil and gas locations. But let's not talk about that tonight. So what we're talking about is we have two different types of height. In essence, we have those that are related to gravity, which are technically the geoid heights, but in practice, we cannot measure the geoid heights. Well, no, technically we can, but then we need gravimeters and stuff like that, and that's going to be very expensive. So we substitute that with our leveling instrument, and from that we get autometric heights. And just to give you an insight, there is a very, very small difference, and that's because with an autometric height, we're assuming the local gravity in our level instrument, rather than looking at small differences. But to be honest, that's a difference that's only of interest if you're a geodetic scientist. For all practical purposes, the two are equal, as long as you keep your leveling distances to within some normal distance, like 25 up to 100 meters. On the other hand, we have the ellipsoid height. So the ellipsoid height is based on the geodetic datum. We've just discussed that. So in essence, GPS will, in its normal form, without any aiding, give us a WGS 84 height. If we're using PPP, there's a big chance we're getting an ITRF XX height. But what it also means is the two are not the same. They're definitely not the same. And as I'm showing you in this picture, what's going on there is, let's assume that the ellipsoid is a straight line, and that we have a uniform Earth, except for this small spot. There's a larger density. Let's, for all intents and purposes, assume that this is gold. It's always nice to spot that. So what's going on? Well, if we're far enough away from this mass, we're only experiencing a uniform Earth. And on a uniform Earth, the ellipsoid center, the datum center, and gravity are pointing in the same direction. And this is especially true if we do WGS 84 or ITRF, which use the mass center of the Earth as a reference. However, the Earth is not uniform. We have gravity differences, and they're due to mass differences, or maybe some height differences, but in this case, we're talking about a mass. And the closer we get to the mass, what we'll be seeing is that the ellipsoid center remains in place. So that's a mathematical thing, nothing changes. However, gravity is locally disturbed due to that larger mass. As a result, if we would have put up a level instrument, well, if we're far away, the level instrument is looking perpendicular to gravity. It does that all the time. That's what we call a centered bubble. However, the closer we get, the more gravity starts to deviate from the ellipsoid. As a result, we're putting up our leveling instrument under an angle. We're not aware of that, of course, because we're still centering the bubble relative to local gravity. But what we're unaware of is that local gravity is differing from the ellipsoid direction. As a result, while my ellipsoid is following a straight line in this picture, we can see that the geoid is bulging over this extra mass in the bottom. As a result, the two start to differ. Now, basically, we denote the orthometric or the geoid height with a large h and the ellipsoid height with a small h. And the difference between the two is what we call the geoid-ellipsoid separation. So the difference, and we can see that that separation is a changing value. If you want to get into some discussion on a birthday party, tell people that you can actually make water run uphill. And looking at this picture, you can see why that could be possible, because the water would be following the orange line. But relative to the blue line, this is actually going up. Why would water follow the orange line? Well, in essence, water put up a glass will always remain perpendicular to gravity as well. So it follows the same line as the leveling instrument. In other words, mean sea level is in essence also the same line. Well, in essence, that is if we wouldn't have any weather or land masses or stuff like that. So actually the tides behave sort of like the orange line, sort of like the geoid, but not exactly, which is a new problem. We need to discuss that as well. Now I'm switching to the Netherlands, sorry. Couldn't find any good geoid data to use for the United States. It's probably out there, but this is an unfamiliarity. So what you're looking up here is the worldwide geoid, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can have a slightly better look. But on the worldwide, well, not geoid, I should say the geoid ellipsoid separation. So this is essentially WGS 84 versus the geoid. And what we can see is that we have geoid ellipsoid separations that run from about -80 to +80 meters. And the biggest change on Earth is to be found in the Indian Ocean. So going from here around India up to Indonesia, we can see that it runs from about -80 meters up to +80 meters. That's a 160 meter difference between the geoid and the ellipsoid between these two locations. We're talking about 8,000 kilometers of difference between these 2 points. So what we're talking about is roughly 0.5 meter per kilometer of geoid ellipsoid separations. So for each kilometer you move, the height difference between the two systems, and this is always what's mind-boggling, because in the real world, of course, nothing happens, but between the two systems, we get a height difference of about 0.5 meter. Now zooming into the Netherlands, I know it's far away, it's a small country, but we've done some gravity surveys in the past. Because the Netherlands is so small, we can spend a lot of money on very dense gravity measurements, giving you nice pictures. So what you're looking at here is the gravity map, and this is the corresponding geoid ellipsoid separation model, but now compared to the Dutch version of the NEVD 88. So this is the NAP in the Netherlands, but this is the land survey level. And what we can see here in centimeters is that things run from -60 to about 1 meter. In other words, going from here in the south to the furthest south is about 1.60 meters of height difference. Now there's no distance scale here, but we're talking about 60 kilometers, something like that. So we're talking, even in the Netherlands, which is supposed to be as flat as a pancake, to a difference of about 2 centimeters per kilometer. And even in this really flat spot, I've enlarged that over here. Might be hard to see the numbers, but I can zoom in for you. Even in this small area, we're going about 2 centimeters over 10 kilometers. Why am I showing you that? Well, in essence, 0.5 meter per kilometer, we can all understand that that's going to be an issue when we do height measurements. But 2 centimeters per 10 kilometers is also an issue, because we're now getting into RTK territory. 10 kilometers is a nice range on your RTK, but if you get a 2 centimeter height difference, well, I know a lot of dredging projects where you would have a lot of discussion, because it's a lot of cubic meters. So it depends a bit on the type of project whether you worry about these values or not, but I'm going to say in dredging, it's usually a bit of an issue. And I already told you on most dredging projects, they will bring an RTK receiver anyway. So what about the tides then? Are they any better? Well, actually the tides are worse. So a land survey datum, that's nice and easy. If we start to talk about the tides, I could actually do a mini lecture on that alone, on tides and tidal levels, but let's stick to just mean sea level. So I already told you that mean sea level is roughly the geoid. But when I say roughly, I mean it will change. And it doesn't only change in location, so it differs from place to place, but it also changes over time. Well, actually, we already know that, right? I'm not sure about the United States, but I do know that one of your former vice presidents actually started this, the water levels are rising stuff in Europe, or at least got the attention, which we still call an inconvenient truth, but that's what it is, a truth. And actually, if you talk to a geologist, they'll tell you, well, what's the problem? The water levels have been rising, not just for years, not just for decades, not for centuries, but they've been rising for thousands of years. Actually, in Europe, we come from about a 40-meter lower water level than we have nowadays. So in essence, rising water levels, nothing new. However, it does mean that the tidal levels are really troublesome to use as a height reference. What I'm showing you here is a picture for Fort Myers in Florida. And this gives you it's over 2 tidal cycles. Tidal cycle, as you may remember, is about 18.6 years long. So these are 2 tidal cycles. Sorry, these are a few more. These are 2 tidal cycles. I need to be correct. But you can see the mean sea level. And actually, you can see that mean sea level, it's not even constant from one year to another. But overall, there is a trend here. The red line is the average trend. The lines above and below that is the indication of where it could go. So we know that water levels are rising, full stop. In this case, 2.4 plus or minus 0.55 millimeters per year. So this is 2.5 centimeter per year. Again, I've not done my best to pick these numbers, but this is about what we see on more places. Some places on Earth it goes faster, sometimes it goes a bit slower, but every location is on average rising. Although that depends a bit on your reference level. Because if you've put up a benchmark and you compare your sea level to your benchmark, actually the benchmark could also be changing. So that's something to take into account. Again, that's a whole different lecture, so I'm going to skip on that. But we need to realize that the tidal levels are very hard to use, and that if we use them, we need to reference them to a certain location and to a certain year. Otherwise, they're useless. It also means that from survey to survey, we need to keep on thinking on what do we use and for what reason. Now back to this geoid-ellipsoid separation, because no matter whether you use the tidal levels or the land survey, as soon as you use a GPS or a GNSS system, you are confronted with the ellipsoid. So like I was saying, in the past, we only had to do with the geoid, now we have both. So what we need to do depends a bit again on the instrument. Now, if we do a leveling survey, and I'm going to assume that your client is interested in a geoid-related height, not something else. So if we use a leveling instrument, we're home free. We're basically getting orthometric or geoid heights, and we can go with the numbers straight away. If we have a tide gauge, as I've just explained to you, well, they are sort of linked to the geoid, but we need to think about these changes, especially over time. Quite often we've got the over location under control, because quite often we have an established relation between a benchmark and mean sea level. However, we need to realize that over the years that will change, so it needs to be corrected every now and then. Then I'm putting up 2 GNSS systems and I'm going to skip over. Why? Well, I'm not certain about your projects, but there's not that many clients that are interested in heights that are accurate to within a few decimeters to a few meters. So basically, plain GNSS or a DGNSS system is not really used for heights. Which brings me to the RTK and the PPP, the nightmares where geodesy is concerned, and they behave again in a different way. Let's start with PPP. So if we have PPP, we're actually measuring absolute heights relative to the ellipsoid. And that means we also need to correct that absolute height with the absolute geoid-ellipsoid separation to come back to an absolute geoid height. If we have RTK, things are more complicated. RTK is a relative system. We already discussed that for the horizontal positions, but it's also true for the verticals. So in essence, if we have an RTK, we need to correct with the difference of the geoid. So we don't need the absolute numbers, but we need to know how much things will be changing between our base station and our rover. It also means that we can play around with that a little bit, because in essence, the GNSS, the RTK, will give us rover positions related to the geodetic settings of the base station. So if we put the base station in our local geoid system, we will get an output on the rover side that is in sort of the same local system, but now without the correction for the geoid-ellipsoid separation difference. You're still with me? This is sometimes something you need to think about, but we have room for questions later, so you need to think about that. So we need to correct with the difference in geoid-ellipsoid separation. So depending on the system, we need to have a different approach, both for the horizontals as well as for the verticals. And as it says here, you also need to remember that the age that you start with, the ellipsoid height, you need to think about all the horizontal datum stuff, because horizontal and vertical datum, well, it's the same ellipsoid. It's the same geodetic datum. So if you're using PPP, there's a good chance that your output is going to be ITRF rather than WGS84. And as you've seen in my picture for the Netherlands, there was about a 2.5 centimeter height difference between the ETRS89 and WGS84. So it does matter. 2.5 centimeters with PPP is about 10% of your accuracy in the worst case situation. That means if your PPP is not running optimally. So it's something we need to start worrying about, and maybe not today, but I would say in a couple of years to come, that's going to be an issue. But the big issue is actually we need this value of n. We need this geoid-ellipsoid separation. And how do we get that? Well, there is a simple solution. You just use a model. And when I say that's a simple solution, well, it's a very easy solution if you have a model. And it's a big if. Because onshore, we see them getting better and better. We have, of course, the worldwide models. I've shown you one, and the worldwide models are sort of okay for worldwide applications. But what you'll find is they'll not give you the centimeter level accuracy that you would get from a normal local model. And when we do PPP, we want centimeter level accuracy because otherwise we're eating out of our error budget. When we do RTK, we need millimeter level preferably. Now to get that, we need to do extensive measurements. And for those interested, about 2 years ago, there was an article in Hydro International about the Strait of Hormuz near Saudi Arabia, where they did a offshore model. And if you read that article, you'll find that they actually did a couple of years of tight gauge measurement, extensive leveling surveys, and extensive GNSS surveys, combined with gravimetric surveys, and then of course a lot of processing to actually generate such a geodetic, such a geoid-ellipsoid separation model. So that was quite an extensive campaign, and that was only a few tens of kilometers wide by a few, I think 150 kilometers long model. So the bigger the model, the more money, the more time needs to be invested. And what we're seeing is that on land, we're sort of getting there in most civilized countries. However, when we go offshore, where we have much more trouble to take measurements, we're getting less and less accuracy. An example that's very near to me is the North Sea between the UK and mainland Europe, where we now have, since a couple of years, a model that's actually accurate to about a centimeter level. Before that, we were running an older model, which originated in 1997, And actually the errors in the model were up to about 20 centimeters. So basically they were worse, the errors were worse than the positioning that we could do. So using PPP was all nice, but the overall accuracy that we get out of the heights was largely influenced by not knowing the geoid-ellipsoid separation accurately. The good news is, if you're onshore or nearshore and you don't have a good model, there is a trick. And for those of you who've been reading ahead, well, the procedure is on the slide. But what you do is essentially you find a number of points for which you know a local height. That could either be relative to mean sea level or to your local land survey datum, so your autometric datum, like NAVD or something like that. And you need, of course, to trust them. They need to be correct. Otherwise, the results will be off by the same amount. What you then do is if you have at least one of those benchmarks, but preferably a little bit more than that, you start to do some land surveying around to the other benchmarks in the area. Now, leveling in those other benchmarks, you of course get a geoid-related height or a height difference. You could do the same with mean sea level data from a tide gauge. And you can have offshore tide gauges, you can do offshore mean sea level. So that means that you can make a model of mean sea level or of your local datum. The next step would be to start doing GNSS measurements. Maybe static GNSS measurements, something like that, post-processed GNSS, where you can get sub-centimeter accuracy. And you need to do the same thing on all the benchmarks you've just established. By doing that, you're establishing the ellipsoid height. And now we have an ellipsoid height and we have a geoid height for the same place. And we can use that information to create a model. Now, I said this is onshore or nearshore because we're now limited by where we can take our measurements. And the further offshore we get, the harder it will be to get accurate data. So there's going to be a limit to what we can do easily, but this is essentially the method that countries are now using to create accurate models as well. The only difference is they're taking much more measurements, they're doing longer term measurements, and they're also doing gravimetric measurements to make the overall readings much more accurate. So to conclude this part, if you use GNSS heights, you need to have the geoid-ellipsoid separation model. Ideally, you obtain it from somewhere. If not, you create it. If you're using mean sea level as a height reference, think about changes in your tidal levels and compensate for that. Well, Nick, or I forgot your name. I think it was Peter.
Pete, yep.
Yes. Yeah, you're just coming into. Well, I've been watching the chat, and I'm not sure if I've seen the same thing you've seen, but they're all awestruck, it seems.
They are. Well, I think either you're explaining it really, really well, which I think you are, and the excellent diagrams and things like that. With no questions on the chat, I've got one which is probably a very tricky one. You're mentioning that you using accurate models, accurate geoid ellipsoid separation models. Have you ever thought about using the uncertainty in these models and applying that to your surveys? Because there is a bigger, depending on the model, there's a lot of uncertainty attached to these models.
Well, actually, we do that a priori on a lot of projects in the Netherlands. We use software for that, and we include the geoid uncertainty where we can. So the answer is yes. But also, I'll be honest, onshore in the Netherlands, we're talking, well, millimeter level. So quite often we sort of ignore that. But offshore, like you were saying, yes, we take that into account. However, what we need to realize is there's some good news as well, because there is not a variable uncertainty. So the good news is it's a sort of systematic error that we're ending up with. So it changed a little bit from place to place. But what we're doing is the model might be inaccurate, but we're taking the value as an absolute number.
Okay, there's one question that's come in here with respect to separation models. What is considered to be the best in Europe and the UK?
That depends on whom you ask. Because if you ask somebody in the UK, they'll say VRRF 2018. And if you ask somebody in the Netherlands, they say you need to use NEVREF 2018. The good news is the two models are connected.
Okay.
Ooh, the question is DTU or NLLAT? I'm not familiar with the term DTU, so either I'm showing my true colors now or I'm missing out on something. Could you please explain that, Simonette?
Looks like a low
Do you hear me?
tide.
I can hear you.
Yeah,
Yes.
okay. So the DTU is the Danish Technical University model. Apparently they're also updating it once in a while. I think there's a 18. But I've been looking to this subject and I was referred by the Dutch Hydrographic Office to NLLAT.
Of course they would.
And that's free.
Yes, although the LAT model, and this is also something to take into account, that's not a geoid-ellipsoid separation model. That's a combination model that also includes the offset between mean sea level and LAT, which is a topic I've sort of avoided because I was pretty certain it wouldn't fit into my half hour or 20 minutes. But actually LAT is something I could also fill 20 minutes with because it's a bit of a variable as well.
Yeah, okay.
So,
yeah, I have to go from WGS or ITRF, whatever's spitting out by the GNSS that I have on board, to LAT.
Yeah, so I'm not familiar with the Danish model, but I would say look at the specs of them. But if you're on the Dutch part of the North Sea, NLLAT would do you fine. But so would VRRF 2018. Like I said, the differences are not that big. And what we see is that they're usually connected to each other. So go for the one that's nearest to the area you're working in. That would be my best advice without looking into the details.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks everybody for the questions. Nick, we should probably carry on.
Sounds good. I was thinking from that presentation, we should have done this 4 days ago with the vernal equinox and make it even more topical.
Well, you can't have everything. Okay, I'll continue to the last subject then. Wow, I'm still sort of on time. I hadn't expected that. The last one was a little bit shorter because I was expecting to run slightly out of time, so we may have a little bit more at the end. So basically to meridian convergence or not. And I've actually seen that some of my students are in this lecture, so it's a good rehearsal from them because in 2 weeks from now we'll be examining them on all these topics. But actually meridian convergence is the one that gives them the main headache. We're still in the adding or subtracting issue. And actually, I'm not sure if Danny Swain's still here, but thanks to Danny, he put me once on track to some of the issues between nations where this is concerned. So meridian convergence. Essentially, let's start with what is it? Short recap. So basically, if we're talking meridian convergence, we're thinking about, again, different coordinate systems. And we're now talking about the difference between the geographic coordinate system, so we're still on the horizontal datum or on the geodetic datum, but also between the projection system. And the projection, I'm talking about the chart projection. So for you in the United States, main projection systems, UTM and Lambert. Of course, different countries, they use different chart projections, although there are not that many in surveying, and UTM, I would say, is the main one. So I'll be using that as an explanation. But basically, what are we talking about? Well, on the chart, all the parallel northing lines on the UTM or the y-axis, it's what we would call chart north. However, in the real world, we have the north and the south pole. Even in the horizontal datum, we have them. And we use that reference as true north. So between them, we have some corrections that we need to think about. Now, there are two important corrections, although when I say important, it depends a bit on your job. But the most important one from my perspective is the convergence angle. And the convergence angle is the angle between grid and true north. Now there's also the Laplace correction. Now, if you're a land surveyor and you paid attention when you did geodesy, you know about this. The Laplace correction has to do with gravity and slight offset between the astronomic and the geodetic measurements. But we mainly concern ourselves with that when we do large triangles. And to be honest, I would say if you're a land survey nowadays, you'll probably be doing your large triangles, if you could call them triangles, using GNSS again. So I'm going to skip over the Laplace correction and just do the convergence angle. So what are we talking about? UTM. These are some of the definitions in UTM. And what we can see is in UTM, we have a cylindrical projection. We know that. And it's transverse to the axis of the Earth. Or in other words, it's at 90 degrees. That means we're getting this picture. And in the UTM, what we have sort of an orange peel. So we're cutting out a slice of Earth and we're projecting that on the map. That slice of Earth is by default 6 degrees wide in the UTM projection, where U stands for universal. Of course, in a TM projection, you can play around with that, but offshore use is the UTM, so we're talking 6 degrees. 3 degrees either side of a central meridian, the central meridian being the line in the middle. Now the line in the middle is also where the cylinder touches the Earth. So that's basically the center line. And what we can see in this grid, we see the blue lines, which are the grid lines. So this is the UTM grid. And projected on that are the 3 meridians. So we have the central meridian in the middle, and we have the 2 outer meridians, which sort of curves. So this is the orange peel, but now sort of flattened. And that has an effect, because what will happen is the meridians by default point to true north. In other words, these curving lines are pointing to true north because the North Pole is staying in one place. However, on the map, the grid north, parallel lines running up on the chart, are pointing in a different direction, while that is depending on where you are on the map. So essentially, we're talking about 2 different sorts of direction. Now the big question is what to do with that. So I've got this slightly complicated picture, which is not that complicated once you start to look at it, but it's another version of the one I was just showing you. So what we have here in black are the true north directions. So true north pointing to the rotation axis of our geodetic datum. And we have chart north, which are the blue lines, which are parallel to each other, pointing up. No problem there. In between, we see a small angle, which is the green angle, which is the convergence. And the convergence depends a bit on your projection, depends on where you are, but runs anywhere from 0 up to 2, maybe 3 degrees, plus or minus. In practice, I always take an absolute number, but I'll come around to why I do that. But that sort of numbers are we talking about. Now 3 degrees sounds like much, and it actually is much. So where an orientation of 3 degrees, that's something to worry about. If you would cross the Atlantic Ocean, you'd go wrong by 3 degrees. Well, you can do the math yourself, but you'd be off not by a few meters, not by a few hundred meters, but you'd be ending up in a different port altogether. That's why sailors like the Mercator map. Mercator map is the only map, the only chart projection that we have that doesn't have any convergence problems. It has other issues, but not for headings. It was made to do that correctly. Now UTM, although also a Mercator map, is not good for headings. Like I was saying, up to 3 degrees of difference. The closer you are to the center of the map, to the central meridian, the better it gets. In UTM, that means that if you have a projection coordinate over 500,000, and I just realized it isn't in this map, but this center line actually has a coordinate of 500,000 east. So that's this line. So basically, anything over that has an issue with convergence. The further we get away from the central meridian, the worse it gets. It also depends on which side of the central meridian we're at. As you saw in the previous picture, we still have the orange peel problem. So basically we have a curving true north line, curving meridian on our flat map. So if we're to the east of the central meridian, as you can see in this picture, we have a true north that is actually pointing to the left if we look towards grid north. On the west side of the central meridian, we're looking in the other direction, so we get another correction. And to the south, it actually inverts. So in essence, depending on the quadrant we're in on the UTM map, we have a different correction. And this is where the adding and subtraction issues start, because now we need to figure out where we are, or we need to really understand the formula that we're using. And I've put the formula here. It's not a difficult formula, but I can already promise you that from chart projection to chart projection, and sometimes from country to country, different formulas are used, which may result in a convergence becoming negative rather than positive. So when you are in the United States, you're a land surveyor, you probably learned a certain rule. That rule might not be correct for other places in the world. So rather than looking at the rules, what I've always done is I've looked at the picture. And if you look at this picture, you can actually see what's going on. Because once I know in which quadrant I am, I can make this drawing. And now we also know that a heading or an azimuth is actually the angular distance, so the arc, between, say, grid north and the heading we need. So basically, this is the grid azimuth. And we can see that with true north being on this side, we're getting a longer true north azimuth. In other words, in this case, when we go from the grid to the true, we need to add the convergence value. It's as simple as that. Just figure out which quadrant, make this correction. How hard could it be? Well, I can tell you, much harder than we think. I've done quite a few lectures with offshore installation companies, and I'm not going to say this comes as a surprise to everybody, but every now and then I see a project manager saying, that's what went wrong when we did that job. So it does happen. I've not heard. I've actually been on a project where we had to install a key wall, and the land surveyor had set it out nicely in grid north. So rather than getting an intended heading, which was a nice round figure relative to true north, we actually get a slightly offset number because this convergence was ignored. Which brings me to the question, when do we have an issue? Because again, convergence, nothing new here. It's been around as long as we have charts. Any chart has this problem, except, as I was saying, the Mercator map. Why should we then be aware of that? Well, it's a big problem when we start to mix up different sorts of directions. And there's a couple of situations where this will happen. And one of the most important situations where this will happen is when we have design drawings that are made in CAD. When we work in CAD, and maybe some of you have done that, we're always working in an X and Y coordinate system. Well, as soon as you work in an X and Y coordinate system, you are working relative to chart coordinates. But that means that if your CAD designer has given or has drawn a nice pipeline or platform on that CAD drawing, and we now need to install the same thing in the real world, we need to go from a chart heading up to a true north heading. And as stated before, there could be a substantial difference. Installing a platform nowadays, angular tolerances are well below 1 degree. So ignoring meridian convergence easily brings you outside of that installation tolerance. So we need to think about that. Another example is when we do a gyro calibration. Now we should do a gyro calibration when we install multibeam, for example, or do USBL. Depends a bit on the USBL. I know there are some brands that have their gyro compass built in nowadays, but let's just assume you have one of those where it's a separate one. If we calibrate the gyro compass, there are a few different ways of doing that. But a common way of doing this is actually taking land survey measurements of, for example, a quayside or something, and then comparing that with the heading as indicated by the gyro compass. Of course, the calibration is not as simple as that. We need to do some steps in between, but in essence, that's what it comes down to. However, if we ask the land surveyor to give us coordinates, 99 out of 100 times we'll be getting chart coordinates back. If we convert those into a heading, we need to add meridian convergence to make that heading into a true north heading before we calibrate the gyro. Now, some people will tell me that's not an issue because we do a patch test with the multi-beam anyway, and if we have any residual problems, we just iron it out with the patch test and the yaw correction. Well, sort of. Quite often, if you have really nice weather during the survey, you'll actually get away with this. So when does this go wrong? Well, as you can guess, when the weather is not that good. Because what happens then? If you ignore the calibration of your gyro compass, or if you still have a residual error in that, what could happen is because the GNSS antenna and the multibeam are not in the same place, we get all sorts of movements in the vessel. Now those movements are picked up by the motion sensor, which we also need to calibrate to get rid of that sort of issue. But also that motion gets translated using the heading between the GNSS and the multibeam. So if we've still got a residual error in the gyro compass, actually with changing headings and also a changing distance between the two systems, we are going to see small effects on the bottom. So ignoring convergence in general is a bad idea. Getting it right is not that difficult, but we need to think about the signs. However, the best option, of course, is to do everything on the chart or in true north, if that is possible. And that means that if you have your CAD drawing, you could put that into real-world coordinates. Although, I'll be honest, if I would be the CAD engineer, the designer, I wouldn't want to do that because working in lat and longs is going to give you a headache. So coming round to how do we solve for that? Well, the best way is, of course, to use appropriate software, make your computation work there, and then do all the corrections in that place. Think about the sign difference. I cannot emphasize this often enough. I've seen this go wrong way too often. It's okay if you stay within the same country, use the same software, use the same formula, everything's hunky-dory. Things go wrong when you go to a different area or a different chart projection and you're unaware of the sign conventions. That is, if you have to do this manually. The good news is most survey software can nowadays show you both numbers. And if you've ever done a range and bearing between 2 points, you will have seen that it will give you the geodetic bearing and the chart bearing. They can give it different names. Same for distance. Didn't discuss that, but your distance will also be slightly off, going from the chart to the real world. When you're not certain about how to make this work, I'm coming back to my earlier advice. I would say, figure out in which quadrant you are, then make the drawing, make a drawing like this, put all your headings in, put your absolute convergence in, and then figure out if you need to have a larger angle or a smaller angle. Once you get the hang of this, it is a rather foolproof technique, but you need to make the drawing. Now, I always tell that to my students, make the drawing, and every now and then there's a student who thinks, oh, I don't need the drawing, it's much easier top of my head. And I'll be honest, it's very hard to get it right top of your head, unless you have a formula with correct numbers, like I was saying. So basically, make the drawing, figure out what's going on, and put your platform in the right location, in the right direction. This was my last slide. I realize I'm slightly ahead of schedule, but well, I have you to thank for that. If you had many more questions, I would have been so in time. So my planning was quite okay. But to sum up what we've done so far, we've looked at horizontals. You need to look at your horizontal datum. Think about what are you doing from what. think about how many datum transformations do I need. We have the verticals. Again, think about geodetic datum. Think about your geode you're using. Think about your ellipsoid and the model between them. And then finally, once you figured out where to put your platform, think about which way it should be heading and apply your convergences correctly. With that, Nick, back to you.
Excellent. Fully concur on the quadrant drawing. Definitely have had that before. And from all the presentations, I'm definitely left feeling a little bit guilty about the time I stuck a receiver on an offshore platform for one survey, and whether that has influenced the wider reference frame from my rendered data now. But Pete, any questions?
Again, excellent presentations, very, very clear, well explained. Could you talk to grid convergence within patch tests? That might be a tricky one for you.
Grid convergence within patch test. You mean the point I was referring to earlier on?
Yeah, actually applying a grid convergence to your patch test as you go across a fairly wide survey area.
In that sense. Well, first of all, my advice is buy the right software. Because if you have the right software, you don't have a problem. Because proper survey software will not work with the chart projection until it publishes the results. And that could be on screen, so you might not be aware that it's doing that. But proper software would use the calculations in the geodetic datum. And if it does that, if it computes its headings from there, you should be okay. If not,
if you go back even 10 years ago, no one was doing grid convergences in multi-beam patch tests. It's a thing, thanks to the software vendors for implementing this and making our life considerably easier and our data a lot better.
Yes, but they needed some pushing to get that to happen. That's why I put in for the double datum transformation. We need to start pushing them towards that as well, because it's an issue that if we are not aware of it yet, will become an issue in the next couple of years. But in terms of patch test, I would say if you do a normal patch test, the area shouldn't become that big that you would have an issue, unless you're in really deep water, because that's the only location where you can do your yaw correction to an accuracy where it would become an issue.
It's also very long north-south lines.
Yeah. But yeah, in that case, well, go east-west. Although if you're long enough, it's still a problem. No, I'll be honest, it's going to be an issue because your data will be continuously changing. So the best would be to get an average. And to give you an idea, we've had the same issue with gyro calibrations. Because essentially, if you do a gyro calibration, if you did that in the old days, when the software was not coping with that, you would need to apply a convergence correction if you went to another area. Because you'd done your calibration in a certain port, then got the numbers. But like I was saying, nowadays, if you use proper software, not the Mickey Mouse variety, and I'm not going to name names, but all the big names should have this under control by now, I would say.
Yes, they certainly do. Yeah.
But it's a good question.
Thanks so much. And everybody's saying great job, well done, great presentations. And I must admit, I have to reiterate what they say. Very, very good. You've spoilt us, and you've set the bar very high for the next person coming in.
Well, I'm glad to do that. And maybe as a final word, I saw that Johan Stam, because he's saying well done, but well, he's actually the one sponsoring this from Skilltrade. So just a little bit of marketing then. I do a lot of the lectures for Skilltrade, and they're slightly slower paced than these, although my students would say, well, not that much. But they'll be done in the same way. So feel welcome to sign up for the real thing, I would say. Although in your case, Peter, if you start wondering about patch test and convergence, you definitely don't need lectures on that.
Nick, any closing remarks?
Yes, self-wise, I mean, again, I'd like to thank Skilltrade for providing the time with you here today. Hubert-Jan, is much appreciated, and particularly considering it's 7:20 in the evening in the Netherlands. We really appreciate it. For those of you like me who need to revisit some of the slides, this presentation has been recorded, and a link to it on the chapter Facebook, link to it on the chapter YouTube channel will be sent out to all attendees. So thank you again, Hubert-Jan, and thank you, Skilltrade. And hopefully we see you all for another presentation in a couple of months' time from a different provider.
Yeah, you're welcome, and we have many other problems to discuss in surveying as it is, so we're not out of munition.
Excellent. Thank you again for your time.
Bye-bye. So, Danny, I still see you're here. Thank you for the compliments. I hope I've not wronged you with me naming you.
Heb ik al.
Heb je camera aan?
Danny is fijn. Nou, Danny zit er.
Je camera.